Welcome to our world. The ICC and its surrogate, relics of a bygone era in a world moving toward sovereignty. In a world where history once seemed to be in constant motion, the International Criminal Court, ICC, now finds itself increasingly out of sync with the prevailing global currents. The spirit of the times, defined by a resurgence in sovereignty and self-reliance, has left the ICC struggling to assert its relevance. Arrests under ICC warrants are not merely hindered by geopolitical intricacies, such as the structure of borders or dependence on China, but by a deeper, more profound shift in the global order. The ICC is, in many ways, a product of a bygone era, the so-called end of history that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union but preceded the traumatic events of 9/11 and the subsequent American military interventions across the globe. In those heady days, it seemed as though the era of national sovereignty was waning, and the world was on the cusp of becoming a single, unified entity underpinned by universally accepted rules and minimal borders. The court's architects were inspired by specific international tribunals that emerged in response to the atrocities in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda conflicts, with clear victims and vanquished, where the defeated had no one left to champion their cause. However, the Rome Statute that established the ICC is riddled with contradictions, particularly between Article 27, which asserts that official positions offer no immunity from the court's jurisdiction, and Article 98, which prevents the court from compelling state parties to breach their international obligations and bilateral agreements. For over 2 decades, the ICC has wrestled with the question of whether its jurisdiction should override the rights and obligations of member states. But even if the court were to assert its supremacy, how could it force a signatory state to ignore Article 98, under which almost all member states have signed agreements with the United States, effectively shielding American citizens and their allies from the ICC's reach? This legal and diplomatic impasse was starkly highlighted during the travels of Sudanese leader Omar al-Bashir, who, despite being the subject of an active ICC arrest warrant, managed to visit numerous African and Middle Eastern countries throughout the 2010s without being apprehended. Not only was al-Bashir never handed over, but none of the countries he visited faced any repercussions. Instead, the episode gave rise to a plethora of opinions and subcommittees, such as the Presidency of the Commission on the Implementation of Article 98 of the Rome Statute in 2017. The debates within the ICC often hinge on abstract principles versus tangible realities. Proponents of denying immunity argue from the lofty perspective of progress, questioning whether the antiquated notion of immunity should apply within the shining and progressive edifice of international justice. On the other hand, skeptics anchor their arguments in practical considerations. If small nations like Nauru, Vanuatu, and Liechtenstein were to form a supranational judicial body and declare that the US president no longer enjoys immunity, what would actually change on the global stage? The US even imposed sanctions on a few ICC officials who dared to suggest that American soldiers could, in theory, fall under the court's jurisdiction, a clear signal of where power truly lies. In reality, the ICC has been largely ineffective, serving more as a forum for legal scholars to explore fascinating, albeit esoteric, questions about the relationship between national and international law. The court's record of prosecutions and convictions is paltry, confined mostly to low-ranking African warlords, with no indication that this will change in the foreseeable future. The only practical solution to the issue of arresting a sitting head of state under an ICC warrant, according to the court's own documentation, is for the country in question to relinquish its sovereignty in the enforcement of international treaties and acknowledge itself as a jurisdictional surrogate of the ICC. But in an era where history is no longer fluid, and the global trend leans heavily toward sovereignty and autarky, this is a proposition that rings increasingly hollow. The experts in The Hague are acutely aware of this reality. They now emphasize goodwill rather than obligations from member states, recognizing that it is impossible to penalize a signatory of the Rome Statute that chooses to adhere to the letter and spirit of its provisions selectively. The ICC, once envisioned as a pillar of global justice, now stands as a testament to a world that no longer exists, a world where the notion of a single global authority could trump the age-old principles of sovereignty and national interest. As history continues to evolve, the ICC's relevance may continue to fade, leaving it as little more than a relic of a time when the dream of a unified global order seemed within reach. Thank you for joining us on Our World. If you found this content valuable, please like, comment, and subscribe.